Well, I guess we should get started honoring those people who are here on time. My name is George Howard. There's sort of two of me. Part of me is a clinical trial statistician. I've been working in randomized trials since, I hate to say it, the mid-'80s kind of thing. And the other one, I do large epi studies. And basically I have the privilege to talk about the a 2-hour lecture on clinical trials. For the people who find this interesting, Gary Cutter teaches a great course in the summer over in the School of Public Health that basically takes a lot of the material I'll be presenting today and goes into a bit more detail. It's a fantastic course. By the way, I start every one of my talks with a plea to interrupt me. I would rather have a chat than a lecture. And so when I'm going along, if there's something you don't understand or something you think I've screwed up, please feel invited to stop me. And if we don't get to the end of the slide deck, I actually consider that a good thing, not a bad thing. I'd rather you have a good understanding of a subset of it than a cursory understanding of the whole thing. And so when I was putting this lecture together, I got to the end of it. Oh, God, this is going to be terrible for these folks. Because what it is like 800 little teeny scenarios of this and that and this and that and this and that. And I hope you have the notes and the handouts and such. And if you want to go into any more detail of each one of these, I'd be glad to. But like I said, this is basically an entire course, semester course, in 2 hours. And so hold on, hot dog, here we go. Okay. But anyway, so I think in every lecture, I think good lecturers always say, this is the important thing. This is the thing I want you to take home. So this is the next 3 slides are the important thing that I really want you to take home if you don't take home anything else. There is basically a spectrum of evidence that starts out with ecologic studies, studies where we look at groups of people. The example always in my life is people in southern France tend not to die of heart disease. And people in southern France tend to drink wine. Gee, I bet it's the wine that's stopping them from dying of heart disease. But there were not measurements in that statement of individuals where I say, I measured Bill drinking wine and I watched Bill not die. I measured Fred not drink wine and Fred did die. It wasn't measures on individuals, but groups of people. If you sort of go up the scientific food chain, the next step are case control studies, where I get sick people and well people and look backwards for what the differences between the sick and well people are. That's followed by the cross-sectional design, where I get a group of people. It's the snapshot study. By the way, I'm assuming you've seen that, so all of these, so I'm going over it quickly. But cross-sectional studies, I get a snapshot of a group of people, and I look at exposures and outcomes at one time. Further up the food chain is the prospective cohort, longitudinal cohort study. In my world, the mother of all of these is the Framingham study, where basically you measure a group, you measure everything you can on people, and then basically patiently wait for them to have heart attacks and strokes. And then turn back around and say, gee, this stuff I measured a long time ago, this is what's predictive of the heart attack and stroke. But today, we'll be talking about the randomized trial, which is always referred to as the gold standard. And if you don't get anything out of the lecture other than this, I hope you understand why this is the gold standard, why this is better. And so what makes it the gold standard? Well, the teaching example of the importance of randomized trials in my academic lifetime has been the Women's Health Initiative. I stood on a podium with Trudy Bush, a wonderful friend of mine, in my arm, back before the Women's Health Initiative started, and very proudly said, we cannot do this trial. We already know the answer. We know that hormones protect women from heart attack and stroke. It is unethical to randomize women to receive hormones or not receive hormones. We need to be getting women on hormones. Okay, it shows how bright and how wrong you can be. Because that, by the way, was based on about 50 really well done observational studies. Really well, thousands of women in those studies, thousands of women. Along come 3 clinical trials, the largest of which is the Women's Health Initiative. They also have ERA and West, or the other ones. 3 clinical trials. And on the basis of 3 clinical trials that contained about 8% of the women that were in the observational studies, what we did was say, oh my God, not only are they not beneficial, but they're harmful. And on the basis of those 3 trials, we threw away all the observational studies and believed the randomized clinical trials. I mean, think about that. That's amazing. And so my question to you is, how do you think that happened? What do you think happened that was so absolutely convincingly wrong in the observational studies? Does anybody have a clue? Confounding. Somebody quietly said confounding. Rah-rah confounding. Rah-rah confounding. So what is a confounder? So basically, I'm interested in estrogen and heart disease risk, and so that's the point I'm interested in. But I have these nasty things called confounders. And probably one of the important confounders in the Women's Health Initiative was socioeconomic status. Because it turns out that rich white women tend to take hormone replacement. Okay? And it also turns out that rich white women tend not to die from heart disease. Okay? And so basically a confounder, and this is one of these things, you got to get this one, this is the take home. A confounder is anything that is related to the exposure, in this case, estrogen, and the outcome, in this case, heart disease. Okay? Anything that's related to both. And when that happens, in this case, what happens is rich white women tend to be on hormones. Rich white women tend not to have heart disease. So it appears as if hormone protects you from heart disease. And at least in my opinion, that's the most likely thing that would happen. So how does randomization fix the confounders? By the way, you ought to be able to draw this graph for doing covariate adjustment and doing case control matching too, and figure out why do they work? Why do they work? So how does randomization work? Well, in randomization, what happens is that the rich white women, half of them get hormones and half of them don't. The poor African American women, half of them get hormones, half of them don't. And so that leg of the triangle is broken. That's where it breaks the leg. Okay? And it doesn't matter that the confounder is still related to the outcome. It is. As long as it's not related to both the exposure and the outcome, it cannot be a confounder. For something to be a confounder, it has to be related to both the exposure and the outcome. Okay, so randomization is wonderful, and the real reason it's wonderful is not only does it fix high and low socioeconomic status, but it fixes it for all the risk factors. Most importantly, it fixes it for the risk factors we don't know about, the confounders that we don't know about. It fixes the confounders we know. It fixes the confounders we don't know. That's the cool thing. That's why it's the gold standard. Okay. So why don't we always do randomized clinical? Okay, this is perfect. Well, this is the. By the way, it's so funny. The current guidelines for hypertension, they came down, and the position of the guideline committee was to only take data from clinical trials, and that was prior to Sprint. And you can see the trouble is that if you base things only on guidelines, you're going to get in. Only on randomized clinical trials, you're going to get into trouble. And the reason why you're going to get in trouble is that research is really a process. It's not, you don't start with the clinical trial. You start with the ecologic study, you do the observational studies. On the basis of observational studies, you decide what things ought to be taken forward to trials. And the second point is randomized clinical trials are frightfully expensive. The ones we do are about 50 million apiece, and you get one answer. Okay? Very expensive answer. Very expensive answer. And also, there are topics that cannot be addressed by randomized clinical trial. There is no randomized clinical trial data on the efficacy of seatbelts. There is no randomized clinical trial evidence on cigarette smoking. Interestingly, when the tobacco companies say there is no definitive evidence that cigarettes cause lung cancer, they are technically correct. Because to get the definitive evidence, you have to get children and randomize them to smoke and not smoke, and wait to see who develops lung cancer. That would be the definitive evidence. And so what they're saying course, it's nonsense what they're saying, but it's technically correct nonsense. Okay, I mean, and so basically, this is the point. Now, when we think about clinical trials, we think about the phase 3 trial, the pivotal trial. But you also don't get there by accident. In other words, let's say that we're going along, we're developing a new compound, we want to bring it to a clinical trial. Well, the first thing we want to do is called a phase 1 trial. You know, most new compounds, they've been given to a lot of rats, but no people when you're starting this process. And so the first, what we call the phase 1 trial, is usually 15 or 20 people. In cancer trials, it's usually your sickest sick. Okay? And you want to give them the drug to make sure that there's nothing mysterious that you did not know, including killing people right away. Okay? So it's a toleration study, the phase 1 study. Normally that's followed by what's the early efficacy study, and the next step is the dose finding study. Now, dose finding, by the way, these terms, particularly for the phases of a trial, people use them differently, so watch out if you're making notes. In other words, these are my definitions, and I think they're the most common definitions, but other people use these terms differently, so watch out a little bit. But phase 2A is usually safety dose finding. In my world, people give drugs, use acute stroke to try to treat acute stroke, TPA for acute stroke, or neuroprotectants for acute stroke. Okay? The dose finding, and what you want to do is there's a belief that the more drug you give, the better it is. That has come out of our cancer colleagues. In other words, what the cancer colleagues do is they want to give as much as they possibly can without harming the patient. Okay? And so the next step is safety dose finding. And so the question here is, I know how much to give a rat, but how much can I get away giving a person? And I wish I had more time to talk about this. The most common way in the past to do the dose finding is what's called a 3+3 step-up algorithm, where basically you treat 3 people, and if nothing bad happens, you increase the dose. Then you treat 3 people. And if nothing bad happens, you increase the dose. And you keep doing that until bad things happen. And if one bad thing happens, what you do is 3 more people at that dose. Okay? And if 2 bad things happen, you say, oops, I've been too far, I need to back up 1. Okay? And so you keep that 3+3. I hope that bothers you as being naive. That, by the way, is really not the smartest way to do this dose finding. I mean, 3 people, what are you going to learn from 3 people? I mean, gee. So basically, there's a hot new area in the dose finding that you need to be aware of. It's called the continual reassessment method. And basically what you're doing there is dynamically adjusting doses and running that through your computer and doing analysis. And wish I had more time. Oops, I wish I hadn't done that. Together. I like that too. But anyway, the safety dose finding, that's followed by what's called phase 2B, which is normally the first test of efficacy. Does the drug do what it's supposed to do? Make people, it make them well in the way it's supposed to make them well. Now, the trouble with the early dose is you cannot use the same outcome as you use in what's coming up in the phase 3 trial. Because if you have adequate power in your phase 2A for the outcome that you're doing in your phase 3, you just did the phase 3 trial. Okay? So typically what you do here is surrogate outcomes. Okay? So let's say that I'm interested in, my example is going to be stroke. I'm sorry, I don't see a lot of you around. But let's say I'm interested in preventing stroke. So my outcome could be, instead of stroke prevention, it could be a good surrogate outcome is MR evidence of small strokes that are a whole lot more common than the clinically pronounced stroke. So you use a surrogate outcome. Important concept, surrogate outcome. The advantage of a surrogate outcome is if it's related to what you're really interested in, you can do your study with a lot fewer people. Okay, you can do the phase 2b study. The drawback is if your surrogate outcome is not appropriately related to what you're interested in, you just wasted a lot of money and got bad information that's going to misinform your phase 3 trial. So you have to be really careful at 2b to make sure you have a good surrogate. Phase 3 is the pivotal outcome, safety, efficacy, regulatory. It's the pivotal clinical trial. It's the one, when we say clinical trials, we tend to think about. They're powered for efficacy. We're going to talk about this more later, not safety. The example of that is Vioxx. Vioxx does great in pain relief, but there weren't enough people in the study to find out that it might or might not cause heart attacks. Because heart attacks are much more rare than the pain, knee pain that you're trying to treat. And so basically, it gets the answer for efficacy. It doesn't get the answer for safety, generally. It gets the answer for efficacy. And then phase 4 post-marketing assessments I'm sorry, I'm still in people's ways. I try to move around. That way I'll be uniformly in everybody's way. But anyway, the phase 4 is trying to go after, most commonly go after the safety. The most common reason phase 4s are done is the FDA makes you do it. Because they say, oh my gosh, looks like people might be having heart attacks. You're going to be required to collect data for the next 2 years, through systems to see how many people are having heart attacks. So it's this process. What we're going to focus on today is this. This is phase 3. Because that's what I think I was asked to talk about, is the phase 3 trial. Okay, now, this is the outline of what I'd like to talk about. And this is when I said 1,000 little topics. Bear with me. And if you get confused about where I'm going to put this up a lot of times so you'll know where we are in this process. Okay? But this is basically the outline of what I'd like to talk about, and it's not everything that you really need to know. This is just the scratching the surface. So let's start off with how do you do a hypothesis, and this idea of a hypothesis. And I'll start by saying that one of the defining characteristics of a good randomized clinical trial is it has well, I'll do that on the next slide. Let me do that on the next slide. First of all, the ethics of clinical trials. If you think about what separates us from the Nazis, it's a very thin wall. We're doing human experimentation. The participants, the patients in these studies are true heroes and heroines. What we're asking them to do, when you stop and think about it, is a remarkable ask. You go to some doctor, you go there because you think he or she's real smart, and you say, I don't know what to do. I've got a coin here, I'm going to flip it, and I'm going to give you whatever treatment this coin says. Well, you don't say it like that, of course, but that's what's going on. Okay? That's a remarkable thing to ask of a patient. It's a remarkable ask. And so basically, that ask is based on equipoise, which is a very confusing concept. Most people don't stop and think about what equipoise is. The definition, by the way, is a general uncertainty in the expert medical community over which treatment is beneficial. The key word there is community. How many surgeons in here? Tons of surgeons out there. Yeah. I hope my surgeons never have uncertainty. Right before you cut me open, I hope you are just damn sure that you're doing the right thing. Okay, it is not uncertainty on the part of the investigators. It's not that you're uncertain. By the way, the reason the drug company wants to do a randomized clinical trial is not because they're uncertain that their thing works. It's because they think it does and they want to prove it. In my world, what we're asking surgeons to do, we're doing in these surgical, in endarterectomy studies, is why don't you randomize patients and lose half of your income? Because instead of treating everybody, we want you to randomize half of them to receive medicine or send half of them to get stents. And so, the reason surgeons do this, in my opinion, is they are confident that they're going to win. Okay, they're confident that they're going to win, and they're going to shoot people that they're better. And that is not a bad thing. That is a good thing. That's the attitude. By the way, the reason why the neurologists want to treat people with the medicines instead of surgery, is they are sure that the medicine is going to win. So the key word here is not what you think. what the community thinks. Okay. The next point on this is interesting. There's a, I don't know if anybody here is from Europe, but the trial differences between Europe and the U.S. are just fascinating. In Europe, particularly in England, they have something called the uncertainty principle. Okay? And it's related to, and I want you to know how it's different than equipoise. In England, what happens is if I go see you as a, and you're going to put me in a trial, it is your opinion that you don't know how to treat me. It's not the community. So the uncertainty principle, when you see it, is individual physicians are not sure how to treat. And so when you read European trial, and by the way, this is a big difference when you read a European trial and a U.S. trial, is watch out for how people got into the study. Because, what our goal is here is we're going to define what the eligibility criteria are, and at the end of the study, we know who to generalize our study to. Anybody who meets our eligibility criteria, these results should be applicable to that group of people. Well, in Europe, they don't have that privilege. Okay, because it's a little bit more of the Wild West. Who gets into the studies up in the physician, a whole lot more. Now, in truth, a lot of our trials also have a flavor of the uncertainty principle. Because, if I'm your patient and you don't think this trial is right for me, even though, you really believe it, I sort of hope you back me out of it. I hope you take care of me. And so, not in the U.S., not everybody who meets eligibility criteria is in certain studies either. But at least they tell the truth, I guess is the right way to say it. And then there's also informed consent. And by the way, I'm a terrible cynic about informed consent. I wish I weren't, but I really am. Have y'all consented patients? Do you think they understood what you were saying? They ain't got a clue. They ain't got a clue what's going on. We have an observational study, and the most invasive thing that we do in this observational study called regards is to draw blood. Our informed consent is 8 pages long to draw blood. We ask a lot of questions too, and do other things. We call them and say, and we're trying to do this. One of our goals in that study particularly is to get lower socioeconomic status people. So, and by the way, we work hard. It's not that we don't care. We work hard to keep it at the 6th grade level, and the informed consent and everything. But I'll tell you that I don't think informed consent really exists. I think it's a crisis. I think it's something we need to deal with. I think the informed consent document is unfortunately not at UAB, but nationwide, is there to protect the institution, not the patient. And I think we need to really come to grips. Your generation can come to grips with how we really can do informed consent. I think one of the rules should be it can't be longer than a page long. I think that would be a great place to start. And I think that if something can happen in 1/10 of 100% of people, I'm not sure it really needs to be told to the patient. And that's the way we need to be thinking. So we do need to get back and really, because I believe in the concept of informed consent. I think they got to know what they're getting into. By the way, it's good for the study too, because if you get people into the study and they don't know what they're getting into, they tend to drop out of the study, which is not good for the study. If you're evil Machiavellian, you want informed consent too. Okay. So what is a hypothesis? You have the defining characteristic, or one of the defining characteristics of a clinical trial is normally a single principle, well-stated, clear, concise hypothesis. Okay? Normally you have one outcome. Normally it is assessed at a fixed point in time or some specified way. You have to, and so basically it needs to be clear, quantified, singular. We'll come back to singular later. Normally a primary hypothesis, there's one primary hypothesis. I've been parts of trials where we've had 5 primary hypotheses. It's sort of what do you call it, a nonsense statement. I was having a senior moment. But anyway, how can you have 5 most singularly most important things? It's sort of a stupid thing to say. This is a study we're doing now. This is the hypothesis from the protocol. And basically it says what the treatments are, what the outcomes are, when they're evaluated, and what population is being treated. That kind of specificity. That kind of specificity. Okay, okay, here's the first sort of a little bit complex, but you hear these words. I want you to believe at least knowing what these words are. Is the idea of superiority versus equivalence. You hear about, is this a superiority trial? Is this an equivalent? Is this a non-inferiority trial? You hear these words all the time. I want you to leave here knowing what these are. So basically, the statistical tradition, which is the superiority idea. Y'all have had a little bit of statistics, right? Well, what you have been taught is that you have a null hypothesis. And normally, the null hypothesis is these two things are the same. Okay? And then you go out and you collect data, you do an experiment to try to prove that your null hypothesis is wrong. Everybody's cool with that. So typically in a clinical trial, you say these two treatments are the same with whatever outcome. And then you set about to prove how wrong you are. So suppose there's a new treatment and an old treatment, that has fewer side effects. And really, it would be, what's really important is I'd really like to show not that this new treatment is better. If it's just as good, that's all I need. Okay? Boy, that's a different problem, statistically a different problem. Okay, now there are two reasons why this superiority trial could not find a difference. The first is there could be no difference. Okay? And the second reason is you might not have had power to see the difference in the study. Okay? And unfortunately, you can't tell the difference between those two things. So if you come out with what I hate this term, if you have a negative trial, we've got to find a better word for it than that. But if you have a negative trial, no difference between these treatments was observed. That doesn't prove that they're the same. Okay, what it proves is that you never ever accept a null hypothesis. My null hypothesis is that they're saying never, no matter how you do any statistics, you never accept the null hypothesis. You only fail to reject it. Okay. And that implies that traditional studies really cannot be used to show that treatments are as good, because that would be accepting the null hypothesis. Well, what to do? What to do? So the answer is change the form of the null hypothesis. Okay. The idea is Blackwelder. Also, these are called Blackwelder trials. Way back in 1982, and his idea is instead of having the null hypothesis be that the two treatments are the same, let's pick the null hypothesis that the new treatment is worse than the old. That's what I'm going to assume as my null hypothesis. Not that they're the same, but that the new treatment is worse. So my alternative hypothesis is now the new treatment is as good or better. As good or better. Remember, it doesn't matter what the null hypothesis is in the alternative. I can never accept my null hypothesis, but I can reject it and accept my alternative. So now I can positively make a statement that, in my opinion, the new treatment is as good or better than the old. That's the trick. That's the Blackwelder idea. So now if we reject the null hypothesis, we are making an affirmative statement that the new is as good or better. Okay? Simple in concept. Right? Simple in concept. By the way, it's really backwards thinking when you start setting these things up. It's really backwards thinking. By the way, non-inferiority is pretty much the same as equivalency, which is pretty much the same as a Blackwelder trial. Pretty much the same thing. There's slight differences, but don't worry too much about it today. So basically, regardless of the form of the hypothesis, a study provides an estimated difference between the treatments. By the way, really, all of the information from every trial you've ever are going to do is contained in the estimate of the difference and the 95% confidence limits about that difference. Okay? Pay a lot of attention to that when you're reading papers and doing trials. Much more, by the way, I think, than accepting or rejecting the hypothesis. Okay. So the link between hypothesis testing and estimation is that if the alternative hypothesis is inside of the 95% confidence limits, you will always fail to reject. Alternatively, if it's outside of the 95% confidence limits, you will always reject. So if you tell me what the 95% confidence limits are, I can tell you whether I'll accept or reject. Okay? Why is this important? Well, what I'd like to do is to use confidence limits to show how this game was played rather than hypothesis testing. I think it's more visual. Okay? And so I have two treatments, an established treatment and a new treatment. I have a dichotomous outcome, percent of people, with the, having some event, and the percent of people in the alternative having some event. And then in general, which treatment is the best? And this is in the superiority trial. And so basically what I do is I have this, the null hypothesis, I should say, is no difference between the treatments, I beg your pardon. And so my null hypothesis is those two rates are the same. My alternative is that they're different, and so my alternative is that they're not the same. This is, by the way, this is really easy stuff. I don't do hard things, I do easy things. Okay? Okay, so basically what do we have? Well, this is the scale. Here's my null hypothesis that there's no difference. So step one is I calculate what the difference is, and let's say that orange bar is what the difference is. Okay. And then I can calculate 95% confidence bounds around my estimate, that orange, which I can, and so that might be the 95% confidence bounds around that estimate. Well, if you stop and think about it, in this case, the 95% confidence limits don't include the null hypothesis. Okay? And so here I would reject that zero is likely. Mm-hmm. So what can happen in a traditional trial? Well, in a traditional trial, I can get the new treatment is better. I can get there's no difference between the treatments, or I can get the new treatment is worse. Those are the three things that can happen. That's pretty easy. Okay, now let's play the same game with the superiority trial, non-equivalence trial, equivalency trial. So basically, the advantage of a traditional trial is I can definitively make the statement that one treatment is better. Okay, I can't definitively make the statement that there's no difference, but I can definitively say one is better. The disadvantage is if there's not a difference, I can't make that statement. Okay. I know I'm repeating this idea of null hypothesis is never accepted. Anytime a lecturer repeats something over and over and over again, that's one of the things they think is important. And so basically you're left with sort of a kiss your sister kind of statement. In this case, there's not sufficient evidence in these data to establish if the difference exists. What intentionally a double negative. Okay? What a disappointing thing to say. By the way, there's always a difference. The probability that two things are equivalent, or exactly the same in nature, is zero to a statistician. And so I know the alternative is always true. It's just sometimes it's so small I can't detect it. It's so small I can't detect it. But again, the manufacturer might always, the example that I deal with is stenting. Would you rather have an aortorectomy or a carotid stent, all things being equal? But the argument is, let's avoid the surgery and just do the endovascular treatment. So if stenting is as good, then we shouldn't do aortorectomies. So what is equivalency analysis? The goal here is to make a definitive statement that the new treatment is as good as better. The null hypothesis is that the new treatment is worse than the old treatment. And here's the trick, plus a little cushion. Plus a little cushion. So basically what I say is that the old treatment plus a little fudge factor is less than the new treatment. Okay? The alternative hypothesis is that it's as good or better. And so, by the way, this little delta, where did that delta come from? Gosh, it seems to have come out of the air. The reason it seems to have come out of the air is it came out of the air. Okay? Okay, so the definition of as good in an equivalency trial really means not a whole lot worse. Okay, When you're reading equivalency trials in the literature, be careful of what this delta is. Because if I pick a liberal delta, I can always win. If I define as good as not killing 4 times more people, I will almost always win that battle. Okay, so when you're reading, when they make the statement, this is, by the way, the reason why, I think this is on the slide, so why equivalency trials are not my favorite, is at the end of the day, you always have to defend your delta. When you do a superiority trial, the delta is not there. You don't have to defend it. But if any time you read or any time you do an equivalency trial, you have to say, I say it's as good or better. And oh, by the way, I've defined as good as being within 2%. It's like 2%. Yeah, it can't be 2%. I think it ought to be 1%. So you end up defending this delta. So what are you doing? Well, again, here's 0, here's delta. And I'm going to, again, calculate the difference. That's going to be my difference. I'm going to do, in this case, a one-sided, we're going to come back to one-sided in a minute, one-sided confidence limit. And basically, if the confidence limit does not include delta, okay, then I say it's as good or better. I'm pretty sure, in other words, what you're saying is I'm pretty sure it's not this much worse. And when I say it's not that much worse, I mean it's as good or better. Okay, so basically what can happen? Well, you can either have the new treatment as good or better, or you'll get the new treatment as not as good or better. So those are the two things that can happen, which I hope the confidence balance makes it clear what's going on. Okay, so what are the advantages of the equivalency approach? The reason you wanted to do it, I can say it's as good or better. I reject, I get to say what I want to say. The statement largely meets the needs of the manufacturer. And so I'll stop and see if any questions about this superiority versus equivalence or non-inferiority. Yes, sir.
So in these two diagrams, which one or the other, the midline is 0 or 1?
I'm sorry. This is my estimate. This is what I'm going to estimate the difference to be.
Yeah, it's like theoretically, is this like would we see the confidence interval when it doesn't make a difference? We were told that it contains 1 or 0. So.
Well, no. In the equivalency trial, in my world, delta is normally 2%. And so if the new treatment is within 2% of the old treatment, I say it's as good or better. Okay, so let's say I estimate that the new treatment is just a 0.5% better than the old. Well, if I say that, then really the 95% confidence, it could be worse. Remember, this is just an estimate. It could be worse. Well, how much worse could it be? Well, it goes all the way down to, in this case, I'm making these numbers up, 1.75%. Well, shoot, if I get 1.75, that's pretty close to 0. Let's call it the same. Not completely fulfilling, by the way.
I'm somewhat lost about the difference in equivalence and superiority trial. That when you mentioned the delta is not a matter in the superiority trial.
Okay, in the superiority trial, oops. There's no delta. All I want to do is calculate the estimate and the confidence bounds, and if it's not doesn't include 0, I say it's different. There's no delta, which is why the traditional trial avoids this need to define what the same means. Isn't it funny to be defining what the same means? But really, in an equivalency trial, when you say the same, you're saying within delta. Where does delta come from? Yeah.
When did people start doing the non-inferiority trials?
Blackwelder was back in the 80s. FDA went through a phase where they were really big on it. The most recent trial we had, we submitted to the FDA as a non-inferiority, and they required us to turn it into a superiority trial. Nothing surprised me more.
So but it's a pretty recent.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, all of statistics is pretty recent. Should be amazing.
I mean, in terms of, I'm thinking like negative phase 3 trials in the superiority sense. I guess were historically interpret it as being equivalent if the trial was made.
Not by an intelligent person.
But
Not by you. Other people misinterpreted it that way.
Okay.
But you would never make that mistake. Yes?
If the new treatment is way better, like let's say you have a treatment that's incredibly better, but you do an equivalency trial, can you detect that it's significantly better?
Okay, so basically the drawback of, let me see if I say this. No, I didn't say it. Okay, traditionally the answer has been no, because that would be, of course, accepting your null hypothesis. There's a really interesting consort, another keyword, consort guidelines, which are the Consortium for Outcomes or something. I think it's one of these acronyms. And there's a consort guideline for the interpretation of superiority, non-inferiority studies. And they've come out and said that you can't. That the way you do it, you can only do it if you fail to reject. Does that make sense?
Okay.
But, yes.
So I hate to make you flip back to the original superiority design.
Uh-huh.
If you have like the bottom row that you're showing where old is better,
Uh-huh.
would your conclusion be I choose to reject the null hypothesis and the old treatment appears better?
Yes.
You can conclude. So really, you can make 3 conclusions on that.
Yes.
Either reject null, old is better, reject null.
Yes,
use
absolutely.
better,
In fact, what you're beginning to talk about is the idea of a one-sided versus two-sided test.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's the next thing we're going to talk about anyway. Okay, so one-sided versus two-sided. I think this is going to answer your question. Okay, so basically, assume there's a new and an old, and, some kind of outcome. The traditional way to do things is called a two-sided test. I don't know whether my null is that the two treatments are the same. My alternative is they're different. Well, there are 2 ways they can be different. The old can be better or the new can be better. Okay? The one-sided says that the null hypothesis is the new is as good or better than the old, and the alternative is that it's worse. Okay? So when does logic suggest that you should do a one-sided test? Okay? And assume that the new treatment would be used unless it's clearly better than the old. Stenting versus endarterectomy. For that matter, surgery versus medicine. That's the better example. I mean, when would you use surgery unless are you interested in proving that medicine is better than surgery? I mean, why would you want to know that? I mean, stop and think. If you're only interested in if surgery is better than medicine. Okay. For example, new treatment is. It turns out I did make these slides. But anyway, the asymptomatic carotid artery study did endarterectomy versus aspirin. If I have a choice between getting my neck slit open or taking an aspirin, I choose the aspirin. Okay. Okay. And so basically, we got started. There's a lot of brouhaha when we were starting it. Surely surgery would not be used unless it's better. So one-sided hypothesis would seem to be logical. Okay. Why would you do it? Well, if I do a one-sided hypothesis, what I do is, technically it's called restricting the alternative hypothesis. Won't go into details. But basically, if you reduce the area that you're trying to prove that your null hypothesis was wrong to go to, you end up with more power, more statistical power. This is an example. I won't go over it because I'm beginning to get slightly time urgent. But anyway, but basically, if I do a two-sided test to detect a 25% difference here, I need 1,000 people. If I do a one-sided test, I only need 800. This is cool. Okay. If I'm not interested in showing the risk of surgery, then I have a 21% reduction in the number of patients I need to put in my study. This is really cool. Okay. Saved $1 gazillion. So when should you consider using a one-sided hypothesis? And the answer is never. Don't ever do it. Don't think about it. It's the siren song. Biggest mistake you can make. Don't do it. Okay? So why should you not do it? Well, the first reason is you're providing valuable proof. if the one-sided hypothesis was used, you technically cannot definitively prove that surgery was inferior. Okay? Why would you want to prove that? And I do not mean to insult my surgery fellows that are here, but basically surgeons are not going to stop operating unless you prove it's worse. Proving it's worse is important. Okay? Because if you say it's worse, then I can write a guideline and say, don't do this surgery. If I don't prove it's worse, I can't write that guideline. Okay? In addition, the one-sided hypothesis smells bad. You'll get killed in the literature. You're not going to get it into a good, better journal. You're going to end up in the journal of lesser results. It's just not a good idea. It's not a good idea. Okay, so now I'm going to return back to here, and right now we're all the way down to here. Okay. By the way, what's the protocol here? Do we stand and stretch, or go to the bathroom, or do we charge through and do? I'm glad to go with y'all's program. Yes, sir. By the way.
Could you in theory test both superiority and non-inferiority with the same trial design?
You can. It's more common to do it if you're going in with a non-inferiority hypothesis. And the reason for that is there's this thing again called the consort guidelines. If you email me, I'll send them to you. I'm just ghoward@uav.edu. It's just an article. And that guideline does say that it's legit to do superiority testing after you've done the non-inferiority testing. But again, remember, what I really believe is all the information is in the estimate and the confidence limit, and all this accept and reject is sort of a bunch of hooey. By the way, you know where 25 came from? Does anybody know where 25 came from? Huh? Out of the air. So there's a guy named R.A. Fisher. 90% of all the statistics you're going to do in your life, this one guy followed. I mean, he's like the Michael Jordan of statistics. He is a rock star, big time rock star. And when they were working all this stuff out, he was at a meeting, and somebody said, gee, Professor Fisher, how much evidence does it take for you to reject the null hypothesis? And he said about 1 in 20 does it for me. What did that, I mean, it was just what one guy thought. A really smart one guy, but still one guy thought. And my challenge for you is consider this point of graph. Consider two studies. I'm going to do two randomized clinical trials. The first one is going to assess if orange juice prevents colon polyps. Okay, and I've come up with a p-value of 0.1, not 0.01, but 0.1. As a clinician, would you recommend that people drink orange juice? I would. I sort of like orange juice. It tastes good. Not a lot of bad things happen if you drink too much sugar, I guess you could argue, but not a lot of bad things happen if you drink orange juice. So the cost of making a mistake and saying that it helps when it doesn't is low. The benefit if you get it right is high. Colon polyps are not a good thing. Okay? Let's say that I'm doing another trial where I'm going to take infant children and split open their chest immediately after they're born. Okay, and I'm going to do something. I don't know what I'm going to do. But it's really important. Okay? And my p-value is 0.05, exactly 0.05. Would you recommend that we split open children's chests? I mean, there's a 1 in 20 chance that you're doing this needlessly. Is that enough evidence? Really? Is that enough evidence? Really? 1 in 20? I've got a lamp on my desk that has 5% white balls and 95% black balls. And it is amazing how many white balls are in that lamp. I mean, the chance of 1 in 20 chance of screwing up on something like that, and the cost of making a mistake and saying this is beneficial, and there's a 1 in 20 chance that you're wrong, not a good deal. And so to me, I think this whole idea of 0.05 is a bunch of hooey. I mean, I think we ought to be thinking instead of robots. Yeah.
So do you still report your p-values?
I do, because I report it to the FDA. You betcha. You betcha. Anyway, so let's go into generalizability versus homogeneity. Okay, so basically, what do you want in your when you're doing a trial? Who do you want in your study? I want to have people who are homogeneous. the divergent subgroups of weird patients can really screw up my study. I don't want weird patients in my study. Okay? That I want to restrict the population. It reduces the noise in what I'm measuring. I can use fewer patients in what I'm trying to accomplish. Okay? And therefore, I want to restrict the population and have them all be nice and homogeneous and all the same. Okay. Alternatively, what I would like to do is I would like to, at the end of the study, I want to be able to say, and I've got this great results, and here's who it applies to. Okay? And I want to have as broad a population as I can possibly get. Okay? And the question of generalizability, technically you shouldn't generalize the people you excluded from your trial. And so therefore what I want to do is I want to have broad inclusions and welcome everybody. And so basically this is a balancing act. You know, what's the right answer? There is no right answer. But you ought to be thinking about it when you're doing the trial. You ought to be thinking about it when you're reading the trials. Who did they put in here? Who is this generalizable to? So basically, it's a balancing act. Weird patients are weird patients. You know, in one of the, if in my stroke studies, I tend not to put in stroke patients less than 45, because I think the thing that's driving them is cocaine, and I'm not trying to prevent cocaine. I'm trying to prevent atherosclerosis. Okay, the results be accepted for all subgroups. Is there really just one disease? What group will be required? Caution. You have to think about this. There's no right answer. Okay. Difficult to, it's difficult to depend on subgroup analyses. In other words, the answer would seem to be, I'm going to accept everybody, and then I'm going to do subgroup analyses, and I'm going to make statements about subgroups. Well, if I power my study for the overall, by definition, I don't have power for my subgroups. So you can't, great idea, doesn't work. Okay? But while we're talking about subgroups, let's talk about that a little bit, because that's really important in randomized clinical trials. Common approaches to use special subgroups analysis. It's a natural question. Within my trial, where it's significant, does it work the same in everybody? In my trial that's non-significant, was there a group of people that it seemed to work in? Very natural question. Is it equally efficacious? Were there groups that were ineffective? These are natural questions. And boy, it sounds like I'm almost talking about confounding, doesn't it? But I'm not. I want to be clear about this. I'm talking about effect modification. Okay. Are there subgroups where the effect of the treatment is different? Effect modification, or interaction, if you're a statistician, can be there. For a confounder, the confounder has to be associated with both the exposure and the outcome. Something can be an effect modifier and not associated with the exposure. So I can still have effect modification. Don't have confounding, but I have effect modification. So what's an example? Let's say I'm interested in the relationship of diabetes and smoking to stroke and people with advanced athero, and I'm going to take this study that I was part of when I was an academic child, the asymptomatic carotid atherosclerosis study. It was surgery versus management. There were 834 patients managed medically, and I'm going to restrict this just to the medical patients. And so basically, there were 21% of the people were diabetic, and I'm interested in, does smoking play a different role in diabetes, or does diabetes play a different role in smoking? So what I want to do is look at subgroups here. So what I'm going to do, and the reason I'm going to do this is, by the way, this woman here, this Barrett Connor, Elizabeth Barrett, the smartest woman, smartest person I've ever worked with. I mean, everything she's one of the reasons that the Women's Health Initiative is not. Everything she writes, I worship. Everything she writes, I worship. And this was an article, and she looked at cigarette smoking and diabetes way back in 1984. And what she concluded, I won't read it, was that they do interact. Okay, you can read it later. And so what I'm going to do is I'm interested in is the increased risk of cigarette smoking greater among diabetics. By the way, the reason I'm interested in this is my son-in-law is a smoking diabetic. Yes, ma'am.
Can you clarify real quickly the difference between the planned and the unplanned subgroups?
That's what I'm doing.
Okay.
That's exactly what I'm doing.
Okay. I'm sorry.
That's exactly what I'm doing. But I'm doing it in a sneaky, devious way.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't catch it.
Okay, and so I'm personally interested in this question. Okay? whoops, I keep hitting the wrong button. And so the hypothesis is the time until stroke between diabetics and non-diabetics will be greater for smokers than non-smokers. So there's literature, I'm personally interested, this sounds great. So what I'm going to do is just an analysis. So I'm going to do an overall analysis first. And so here's time to stroke by diabetes status, and it's non-significant, but the diabetics, in fact, they're doing a smidgen worse. Okay. But, and then what I'm going to do is, there's a 43%, the hazard ratio is 0.43. The increase was insignificant, but that really isn't what I was interested in. I was interested in the subgroup analysis. Okay? So time to stroke for diabetes status. So here it is for the non-smokers, and here it is for the smokers. So basically, if I'm a smoker having diabetes, it's really bad for you. Diabetes is not that bad for you if you're a non-smoker. In this population. Okay. So I'm going to write a paper. How many people think I can get this published, by the way? There was a trend for diabetics to have a higher risk of stroke events. That was primarily among smokers. That's where the effect was, where the risk of diabetes was 3 times greater. Okay. These findings are confirmed by the previous literature of Elizabeth Barrett Connor. This is hypothesis-driven research, believe me. Okay. I'm personally interested in it. It confirms my belief that diabetes is important, and it underscores the importance of having diabetics not smoke. I'll guarantee you I can get this published. Absolutely guarantee I can get this published. Okay? So what really happened? What really happened? Well, to begin with, I lied. Okay? I lied big. Okay? And so basically, first I did an analysis of hypertension when I was preparing for this lecture. I'm really more interested in hypertension than I am diabetes anyway, because it's just a neither variable. Overall, it was non-significant, and I looked for findings in subgroups, and I looked at smoking within 2 subgroups, and there was nothing there. And oh, by the way, I also looked at sex, race, bruise, alcohol intake, height, weight, previous endarterectomy. I looked at the kitchen sink. Nothing really excited me in those 44 separate analyses. Okay? There's just nothing I wanted to talk to y'all about in those 44 analyses. It took about 15 minutes to do that. That's really, I mean, I think the danger of computers is it's like giving shotguns to children. I mean, it makes it so easy to do this stuff. It ought to be hard. But it's not. It's easy. I mean, this was 15 minutes work. Okay, I then did cigarette smoking, and it was not significant. And I did the same 44 analyses there, and nothing really excited me. It took another 15 minutes. I'm now invested 30 minutes in this lecture. Okay. Then what happened is I finally looked at diabetes, and overall it was not significant, but I found this effect in smoking. And at that point, I remembered Elizabeth's paper. Okay, I said, oh, Elizabeth kind of wrote about that way back in the 80s. So I pulled that literature out, went back to, found her old paper. Okay, and I ignored, by the way, the significant findings for ever drinking. It turns out there was an effect for ever drinking that I didn't tell you about. Okay, there was an effect for previous endarterectomy, bruise, and whites, and hypertension, the middle tertile. Wait, I'd love to explain that one. I mean, that would be really easy. Why smoking is important only if you're in the middle tertile of whatever. And the mechanisms can be hypothesized for some of these. And so in total, I did more than 100 analyses. It was closer to 120 analyses. It took me about 40 minutes. I reported only things to you, though, that will confirm my biases and my sense of the literature. Was I cheating? And so the answer is, and if so, how bad did I cheat? Okay, and the answer was is on this graph. Okay, this is an important graph. This goes to your point of pre-planned subgroup analysis. So if I do exactly one test and nothing is going on, what's the chance that I say something is going on? One test. Somebody say 0.05. That's what that is. That's what 0.05 is the chance of saying something is going on when it's not. Okay. If I do 2 tests, so I pretend like I have a coin, and there's a 5% chance of this coin landing on heads. I flip chance of it. If I flip it twice, what's the chance of me getting at least one hit? Well, it's not 10%, it's a little bit below 10%. Won't wonder why it's not exactly 10%. But if I flip it 30 times, the chance of getting at least one hit, even though it's a 5% chance, only a 5% chance, I have an 80% chance of saying something is going on when it's not. Okay? If what I did and presented to you, here's 50, I did 100, so it's out over here. There's no doubt I was going to find stuff. I knew I was going to find stuff. I mean, one of my favorite articles ever, I don't have time, but you can cheat. It's easy to cheat. You can make it sound like you aren't cheating. When you're reading the literature and there's not a statement about pre-planned subgroup analyses, watch out. People can cheat. Okay? It should be in the statistical analysis plan, should be laid out. There are ways that you can adjust for how many tests you're doing. I don't like doing that. I'd rather just be honest about how many I did and let you interpret whether you believe it or not.
I have a question. At what point does the magnitude of the effect play into your statistical analysis?
Oh, if I want to cheat and get a really big magnitude, what I want to do, I mean, you know.
Let's say you saw the diabetes and smoking, and the difference was tenfold. How does that play into your statistical analysis? In other words, is that still cheating?
Oh, are you telling me how many subgroups I'm looking at?
Well, no. If you're looking at 100 subgroups, but one of them has an enormous magnitude.
Oh, I can make it as big as you want. Just let me do enough testing. I'll find one.
Okay.
I mean, trust me. What you're really saying is I don't have a coin that has a 0.05 level. I have a coin that has a 0.01 or 0.01.
Yeah, 0.0.
Well, if I flip that coin enough, I'll still get ahead there too. I mean, if you let me cheat, I can get whatever answer you want. And so watch out for the pre-planned analysis, limit them. Don't look at a lot of different subgroups. Try to restrict what you're doing. Be aware of the fact that the more you look, the more likely you are to find a spurious find. Okay? Keep doing that. So I flagrantly cheated, and the results still remain. I can still get this published. I know I can. I don't think I can get this published. I know I can get this published. Okay. So it's natural to do it. It's one of what I call Hill's criteria. It's one of Hill's criteria of what do you believe, and so I'm going to skip this a little bit. But if you're a consumer, just watch out. I've already said it. All this slide says is watch out. I'm sorry. This goes for 2 hours, I hope, right? Yeah. I guess good. Anyway, so this, by the way, is the traditional way subgroup analyses are presented in clinical trials. This is called a forest plot. Where did that come from? Literally, Forrest thought it was a good way to present data. So therefore, we call it a forest plot. And if you're really smart, you'll capitalize Forrest in your paper. You say the Forrest, capital F plot is on page 8. Because it was Forrest that made up this idea. So here's diabetics, non-diabetics, current smokers, so here are all the different subgroups. This is atorvastatin better, placebo better. What is your interpretation of that? You see that, what do you think we should do? Should we treat women? Women are here, female, a little bit worse. Do you believe that? By the way, Neil Poulter is a good friend of mine, guy who wrote this paper. And he published this and actually had somebody talk and say, I can't believe that you're telling people not to treat women. And he said, did you read the paper? If you look at a lot of different subgroups, funny things happen. You've got one quirky finding out of all of those. What's the chance you get one quirky? I hadn't counted them, but it looks like it's about 20 things up there. What's the chance you get one quirky finding? You got one, you ought to expect one thing to be quirky. Okay, so I look at that and say, well, don't really believe that. Should I treat diabetics? Well, that looks like it might be a difference. Basically, I looked at 18 differences. I found no significant interactions. To me, what this figure shows is not heterogeneity for women, but homogeneity of effect for a large number of subgroups. So when you see these things, chill out a little bit. I mean, don't play hardball with this. Quirky things happen. Quirky things happen. Whew. Okay. Subgroup analysis. Endpoint, efficacy versus safety in these trials. Okay, and boy, do I wish I had more time to talk about this. This is really complicated. For something that seems so simple, it's so complicated. Okay? Basically, trials are designed to assess efficacy. Boy, I typed that sentence wrong, didn't I? Let me tell you what that should have said. Okay, that should have said trials are designed for efficacy. Trials are designed for efficacy. Okay? Consider the hypothetical case that for stroke, what I'm trying to do is improve the ranking score. And let's say that I have a drug that for 80% of the treated patients at 90 days, the ranking is better. That is, it's clearly efficacious. In 80% of the people, there's a benefit. Turns out that in the other 20%, they died on day one from the cerebral hemorrhage. Okay. Clinicians here, does this sound like the drug you want to use? I mean, it's beneficial in 80% of the people. Okay. This is the efficacy statement. This is the safety statement. Okay. And I'll get to that. Would you recommend this treatment? And generally, even efficacious things are not recommended if they're unsafe. And this year's example of that is Vioxx. Great on stopping pain. It's just this nasty little thing about causing heart attacks. Okay. So clinical trials are focused on efficacy. If safety is so important, why not have it as part of the goals? Why don't we have a safety outcome? Okay? And the answer to that is usually you're pretty clear about what you want to do in terms of efficacy. When you're thinking about this, you're saying, I want to use this drug, and I'm going to use this drug. If the modified ranking is better, that's what my outcome is. Well, what do you want to not have happen? Well, what you want to not have happen is a whole lot hard, generally, it's a whole lot harder to specify. You can kill people, you give them headaches, you can, I don't know, you make up the list. I mean, you can cause cancer. Am I supposed to make up? And until you do the trial, you don't know what the safety problem is going to be. And so you end up with this being a gut check. You sort of look at it and you say, I didn't anticipate that, and if I believe that, I'm not going to use this drug for safety, even though it's efficacious. Does everybody understand the difference? Efficacy is focused, safety is broad. More later that's why you have a data and safety monitoring board, and I hope I make it that far. Okay, so now we're through with this, and we're going over here to masking. By the way, the Eye Institute, if you really want to make them upset, write a grant to the Eye Institute and talk about blinding. I mean, it does not play well at the Eye Institute to talk about blinding your patients, and they have really pushed hard to use the term masking because that you still can't see, but we're not putting out eyes or anything like that. Okay, so bias from the investigative steps. So basically, clinical trials are supposed to be at equipoise. Remember, that doesn't mean you're at equipoise. That means we're at equipoise, right? We're at equipoise, not me. Okay? It's not hard to change. It is hard to change the preconceived notions about benefit. For example, people, both the patients and the investigators, always assume that the active treatment is better than the placebo. I love this cartoon. I think this is Hiram S. Dunson, 1930 to 1993, member of the placebo group. Okay, there's an assumption that the placebo is better. By the way, it turns out that it's not always better. If I had more time, I'd talk about the alpha-ketoprol beta-carotene trial, where back in 1990, y'all are young. In 1990, people thought if you loaded people up with antioxidants heavy enough, you could actually get away with smoking. If we load people up, and I know it sounds stupid now, but that was really the belief. That was really the belief. And after all, beta carotene and alpha ketocol, there's no side effects to those, right? And so there's only benefit. And so they did a randomized trial into, I think it was the alpha ketocol. I think it was one of the treatments anyway. I think it was alpha ketocol. The people in that treatment group not had more cancer, had more heart disease, had more car wrecks, had more deaths. I mean, there's no endpoint that the actively treated people did. I mean, sometimes you're just wrong, which is, of course, why you're doing the trial. But anyway, so basically, physicians want to help people, thank goodness, and so they want the active treatment to do better, and so it's better for the evaluator if the evaluator knows the assignment. A lot of times they can get the answer they want. Did you were you able to recover and walk? No, I couldn't. Are you sure you couldn't walk? You're in the active group. You sure you couldn't walk? I mean, you can get the answers you want. And so basically, equal evaluations provide opportunities to discover events. This is the other reason for blinding. Okay? And so, for example, if I'm doing a caloric restriction grant and I've got one group coming in weekly for visits, and the other group is not coming in because don't need their counseling, I can discover events when they're coming in for the visits. And so just because I'm looking at them, I can find more events. If I look at surgical follow-up, if you go back to the surgeon might find something. If you don't go back to the surgeon won't. The great quote, a patient doesn't have a temperature unless you take the fever. Okay? But the more times you look, the more likely you are to find things. So both groups have to be treated identically. So for example, on this one, what you have to do is figure out some reason that you think is not related to your treatment. Get people to come back in and do something with them at the same frequency you're doing it in the caloric restriction. Okay, each visit is an opportunity to find something. And so basically biases can be avoided if neither the patient or the physician knows about the treatment. Duh. It implies that the follow-up schedule is identical. The old term is blinding, new term is masking. Double mask is neither the patient or the investigator knows the treatment. Single mask is usually the patient does not know the treatment. Could be, when you say single mask, it means somebody knows, but we don't know who. So what are the challenges to masking? It might not always be possible. In my world, if there's a great big scar on the side of your neck where you used to have atherosclerosis, chances are you're in the surgical ward. Responses to masking. In the PEPI study that I was part of, postmenopausal estrogen progestin, women got randomized to estrogen alone. Okay? And so there was no cycling. And so basically, you tend not to notice that you're having periods. So basically, you can begin to know what group you're in. For serum or other assays, you need to try to protect those. The participation in the treatment group, low fat, exercise. So the common approach is to at least blind the rater. This one's important. If you can't blind the patient, you can't blind the doctor, get somebody else who doesn't know what group they're in to come in and evaluate the outcome, who doesn't know what they're in. And like good scientists, we've made up a big fancy word for that. That's called the prospective randomized observer blinded evaluation, the probe design. In other words, in CREST, what we have is the patient knows what happened, the doctor knows what happened, but whether or not they have a stroke is done by a committee of physicians who review the medical records that have been blinded for treatment. At least as blind as we can get. The other thing you can do is move towards a totally objective outcome. If your outcome is death, I can adjudicate death. I mean, no medical training whatsoever, and I can reliably measure that in an unbiased way. Okay, so stop and think about the corollary of that is the importance of masking is a function of how subjective the outcome is. The more objective the outcome, the less important masking is. How do you feel is the ultimate I need to be asked question. And again, you can have an independent observer. So we're back to this. We're finally getting down to what I consider the more fun junk. Okay? And so first of all, the idea of intention to treat. I'm sure you've heard of intention to treat. Okay, but so if you haven't heard it, you're getting ready to be surprised. Okay, so basically I have 100 patients in 2 groups, surgery and stent. Of those, the people in the surgery group, 10 people raised their hand, and this actually happened to us in our study, no joke. And they said, the only reason I wanted to be in this study is unless I'm in this study, I can't get a stent. And now that I'm not getting a stent, I want out of the study. Okay? But what I've said here is they demanded to get a stent. And so do we compare the 110 that got a stent to the 90 that got the stent to the 90 not getting stent, or do we compare the 100 and the 100? And basically, it seems like on the surface it makes perfectly sense to only analyze the people who got the treatment. You're dealing with small pharmaceutical companies who haven't heard this before. They really only want to conclude people who get their drug. Trust me on this. Okay? These are the patients where treatment can make a difference. However, remember that, I'll just go over this instead of doing the slide. The whole idea of randomization is to have the 2 groups equal. That's why you're doing it. If what you're doing is taking people out of one group, let's say that the people who came out were the young, aggressive people, the highly educated people who knew what stenting was. So what I'm doing is taking out of one group these really smart people and putting them in the other group. And being really smart, by the way, is good for you health-wise. And so you live longer. Those 2 groups are no longer equal with those patients over there. So I have to, the old phrase is once randomized, always analyzed. Once you randomize somebody, you're stuck with it, whether they're eligible. Let's say you randomize somebody and it turns out they're ineligible. They're randomized. Shucks. Okay. Analyzing the treated loses randomization. You have to protect, the phrase is protecting randomization. You want to protect randomization. It's the precious thing that allows you to not worry about confounders. Make sense? So, by the way, that does not mean that I'm not going to do a per protocol analysis at the end of the day, and also include as a secondary outcome the people who got treated and the people who didn't get treated. That's going to be in my paper too. But I'm going to call that a per protocol analysis or an as treated analysis. And it is secondary. If I don't win on my primary, I don't care about my secondary. Okay. Statistical power, and wow, I wish I had more time for this one too. This is an hour lecture, really. I'm going to do it in, I think, 3 slides. Okay, so we tend to live, and so basically what I have is the truth. Okay? And in truth, my null hypothesis is there is no difference. So let's say the null hypothesis is true. There really is no difference. Okay? Statistical testing lives in this column. And given that there really is no difference, I'm either going to say there is no difference, or I'm going to say there is a difference. Or no evidence of a difference, or I'll say there's no difference. And basically what happens is if there is no difference, I say there's no difference, I'll win, I got it wrong. Yay me, okay? Okay. On the other hand, if there really is no difference and I say there's a difference, the test concludes there's a difference, I lose. I've made a mistake. I've said that the treatment works when it doesn't, generally. Okay? That's called a type 1 error. Saying that something is going on when it's not. Okay. Why do I care about that? Is that a costly error? Well, frankly, it depends on what you're studying. Okay? But in general, what you're getting ready to do is recommend a treatment that doesn't work. If it has side effects or if it's expensive, you really have messed up. Okay? We spend less time in this column, the alternative hypothesis column. Could turn out the alternative hypothesis is true. There really is a difference. Okay? If there really is a difference, and I conclude that there's no difference, I lose. Okay? I should have said there's a difference. I said there wasn't. Okay? That's called a type 2 error. Okay? Is it expensive to make a type 2 error? Well, it depends. You know, what you're getting ready to do is to take a promising treatment that could have saved people's lives in a pivotal clinical trial and say it's unimportant and not helpful when it was. It will never be tested again because once you have a clinical trial out there, that pretty much shuts it down. So whatever benefit that treatment would have had, you've just flushed. Okay. Not only that, and a lot of people, I'll do that in a second. I'll do that in a second. But anyway, but if there really is a difference, and I say there's a difference, I win. I got it right. Okay, that's called power. Okay. If there is a difference, I want to be able to say there's a difference. That's my statistical power. By the way, these two things add up. Obviously, you're either going to say there's not a difference or there is, and so that plus that's 1. So basically, type 1 error is saying that the null hypothesis is false when it's really true. You need to decide how much risk you want to take. That's the alpha. That's the alpha. Usually, alpha is 0.05. Do I say that? Mm-hmm. Yeah, normally it's 0.05. I wish that we could be more flexible. Our society won't let us be flexible. Okay. Type 2 error is failing to say that the null hypothesis is false, when in fact it is false. Okay. We need to decide how much risk you want to take there, too. That's one of the design parameters. Okay. I mean, that's not a number. By the way, and by the way, this 0.05 is this arbitrary number out of the sky, no real justification. Here are 2 more arbitrary numbers right out of the sky, no justification. Normally we use 0.1 or 0.2, which is a 10 or 20% chance of spending 5 years of your life doing an experiment. When the thing really worked, but you were going to waste the 5 years of your life and say it didn't. You know, and one of the things I've encouraged all young scientists to do is carefully count up how many 5-year periods you have in your life left, your academic life left, and think about how you want to spend it. Before you do a study, stop and say, I only have 5 more 5-year periods. Is this how I want to spend one of my 5-year periods? Okay, so by the way, if it's 10 or 20%, this would be 90% power or 80% power. And if you stop and think about it, when you do a study with 80% power, stop and think. There's a 1 in 5 chance that even if this darn thing works, I'm not going to see it. Is that really what you want to do? By the way, it's huge pressure and sample size to use 80% power. So beta is the chance of making the mistake. This must be making a correct decision, and that's the statistical power. So one of the things that I think is taught poorly in my field is this idea of power calculations and sample size calculations and all that kind of stuff. This is the 30,000-foot view. The 30,000-foot view is there are 5 numbers, and they're all in one formula. I'm not going to give you the formula. If you want it, I'll be glad to give it to you. The first is the chance, the level of evidence that is required for you to say there's a difference. Okay, that is alpha. Okay. The second is the likelihood of seeing a significant result if one exists. That's the statistical power. That's beta. The third is what is the true difference between the 2 treatments? Is it nothing? Is it medium? Is it great big? That's delta, the true difference between the. The next is the sample size. Okay, that's N. Okay, and the last one is how much noise is there in the system. Is this, can I really measure these outcomes well? And that's going to be sigma. Now the key is that if I know any 4 of those, I can solve for the 5th. They're all in the same formula. Now, yes.
So if a study is underpowered, so like it didn't accrue enough people and wasn't adequately powered, but it has a significant result, then that significant result still valid?
This is a wonderful question, and I really appreciate it. I wish I'd put this in the slides. I will make sure I'll invite you back. Power is a design consideration, not an interpretation consideration. Once something is significant, it's significant. By definition, if it was significant, you had enough power to see a difference. How do I know that? I saw a difference. Okay? It is all in the design, it's not in the interpretation. Now, if you do a test, a study, and it's not significant,
Then the power.
ooh, now there are two reasons why I might have missed that. One is it ain't there, and the second is I didn't have enough people in my study to see it. Then it becomes important. Okay, but if you, okay, and so basically, really quickly, if I don't know the power, what I'm doing is performing a power calculation. If I don't know the difference, what I'm doing is calculating the detectable difference. Okay, if I don't know the sample size, then what I'm doing is a sample size calculation. Okay? But it's just 6th grade algebra. I mean, the formula is really pretty easy. I just don't have time to do it in 2 hours. So moving on, interim analysis. Interim analysis. Suppose you're halfway through a trial, and somehow, even though you're blinded, you know that the treatment is already so far ahead, the new treatment is already so far ahead, that there's no way it can lose. Okay, number one, you can't really know that because you're going to be blinded. But let's say you did know. I'll argue that you are both ethically and financially responsible to stop the study. Both ethically and financially. Okay. How can you keep randomizing people to a trial, to a study that you already know the answer to? In particular, how can you give them the, are you going to walk up and say, well, you know, there used to be no uncertainty between these two treatments, but now I really know one's better. I promised the government I would put 2,000 people in this study. Would you mind if I randomize you anyway? I mean, that would be real informed consent. And chances are you get a lot of people to agree to that. Okay? Okay, so basically this is a hot area. There are 2 ways to think about, by the way, why don't I keep looking all the time to see as soon as I can when I find the difference? Well, that goes back to multiple tests, the same as in subgroups. And every time I look, there's a chance that I will, by accident alone, see a difference. And so if I look all the time, I have to pay a penalty for looking. I have to pay a penalty for looking. So the first way we do this is called group sequential trials. This is 99% of the studies you will ever read. They'll say the stopping rule will take about 90% of the time, 99% of the time there'll be a stopping rule, and 90% of that time it's going to be O'Brien Fleming. We'll come to that in a second. Okay? And the idea here is I'm going to plan a large study and see if I can get away and do a little study. So I'm going to say I'm going to do as many as 2,000 people, but I'm going to look when half the people are there and see if there's a difference there. And if it is, I'm going to stop the study and only do 1,000 people. Okay? Plan the big study, group sequential, plan the big study, try to do the small. Okay? The most common approaches are O'Brien Fleming, Randomized, Pocock, and Pito. Okay? And don't worry about what they are, other than the fact that what they're called, I love this term, they're alpha spending functions. Alpha spending functions. I have 0.05 alpha in my hand. And every time I look at the data, I'm going to give you some alpha. I'm going to spend part of my 0.05. Okay? So what is the advantage of spending early? A lot of the alpha early. Well, that means if the difference was really there, I get to see it early. I get to quit early. So why don't I always spend early? Well, if I'm spending it early, when I get to the end of the study, I won't have very much of my 0.05 left. And so instead of testing at 0.05, I'm going to test at 0.01. Because I've got to spend that alpha. That's what you're doing in these rules. The most common of these is this O'Brien Fleming. And O'Brien Fleming spends very frugally early. The differences have to be immense in O'Brien Fleming to stop early. But what you're left with at the end of the day is usually a p-value of like 0.075. Okay? Because as that gap opens between, well, I think I say this, it's widely accepted. Oh, no, and see the disadvantage of the alpha spending is, let's say that my final p-value ends up being 0.045. And the p-value that I get in my study is 0.07, 047. I messed that up, let me try again. Okay, okay. The p-value, the critical value is going to be 0.045. With all the alpha, so that's how much alpha I have left at the end of the day. Okay? I do my test and I come up with 0.047, a little bit too high. Then I get to say, P is less than 0.05, the study is not significant. I don't want to spend a lot early. I want to keep that last P value as close to 0.05 as I can. Does that make sense? Okay, there's another way. This is the hot new, if you want to sound like you're really cool and you're really smart, by the way, this is as cynical as I can be. If you really want to sound like you're hip, you can say, I'm doing an adaptive design. Okay? And the idea of an adaptive design is I start with a small study, and then I go and see how big it needs to be. Okay? Group sequential will start big, try to quit early. Adaptive, start small, see how big I need to go. Okay? Rapidly evolving area, hot research, a lot of dissertations in this, tons of dissertations in this. Adaptive design is a very ill-defined term. It's like saying bioinformatics. I hate the term tell me what bioinformatics means. The adaptive approaches fall into two broad domains. If you're reading an adaptive trial, this is an important thing to stop and think about. The first kind is adjustments for the estimation of nuisance parameters. A little bit of a technical sentence. The nuisance parameter in my world is what proportion of the people are going to have a stroke. I think I know that when I start. By the way, the more people have a stroke, the smaller the study it can be. Okay? And I have to guess that number before I start my study. And if I guess too high, my study is underpowered. And if I guess too low, my study is overpowered. Okay? So why don't I start collecting some data and see what the stroke rate is, and then I can change the size of my study to have the right power. Okay? That's not looking at the treatment difference, but a nuisance parameter, part of the sample size. The adjustments the other type is adjustments based on interim estimates of the treatment effect. So let's say I go halfway through and say, I thought there was going to be a 5% difference between these. Lo and behold, there's only a 3% difference. My study has to be bigger. Okay? There I'm talking about what the observed treatment difference was. Not a nuisance parameter, but the treatment difference. Is this making sense, y'all? Okay. Anyway, so the validity is nuisance parameters are well accepted. Adaptive trials for nuisance parameters. This is cool. Good science here. The jury is still out on this idea of looking at no effect and trying to adjust for it. If you're reading a study and they did that, go find a good statistician to help read it with you. Because how you do that turns out to be a mess. There's an FDA paper that describes this, but I've tried to read it and I can't understand it. It sounds like government double talk to me when I tried to read it. And so which approach is better? If you want to plan a big study and make it smaller, start a small study and make it bigger. Both of these seem reasonable. Nothing wrong with either one of these ideas. So I'll put out the criteria, which one provides a smaller sample size or more power, which is more logistically easier to do, and what other criteria should we use? Okay, so this one's easy. Which one has more power? Statisticians never get to say the word always. It's amazing how infrequently you get to say the word always in my business. This is Bruce Posidis, and he says an adaptive trial, no matter how it can be attained, can always be improved upon by a likelihood ratio test that uses the same acceptance ratio and rejection ratio as the adaptive test. That is, regardless of how you set up the adaptive trial. There's always a group sequential trial that is as good or better. It's impossible for the adaptive trial to know. Literally impossible. Okay? Which one is logistically easier to implement? Well, it depends I think, on who you are. Let's say that you're a farmer. It's supposed that you have a new compound, you don't have a lot of experience with your new compound. You need to get to the market as quickly as you can. Adaptive trial might make some sense. We're going to get it started, see what happens, find out how many people we need, but I'm sort of confused. Why would I do even any program where I'm going to spend $1 billion or $1 million if I don't have a lot of experience with the compound? You might actually want to get experience with the compound instead, I would argue. Let's say that you're an NIH researcher. Can you imagine writing a grant to NIH that says, I don't know how big my study's going to be. Why don't you give me a lot of money and I'll get started, and I will tell you later how much money I really need. Okay? This idea of adaptive trial might not be as cool as it sounds on the surface. In the NIH work, stopping early is a big win, but going longer might be a larger problem. There is one time, and this is Chris Coffey's very good observation, that we ought to be doing an adaptive trial. Every time we write one of these NIH grants for clinical trial, we lie through our team. Okay, we say we're going to do it in 5 years. We're going to recruit 100 patients a month. And then you get started and you recruit 30 patients a month. Every trial, I don't care what disease or anything, always goes too long. Okay, so the time an adaptive trial would be cool is when you're getting your grant refunded. Okay, so I go out 5 years, now I have to write the grant for the next 5 years. That would be the time for adaptive trials. How big does this study really have to be now that I've got this much data? So that would be a cool idea. So basically, it's saving the study. The third issue is saving the study the right thing to do. And so basically, should there be boundaries on design? So let's say that what you did was you thought that 90% power, I defined the clinically significant difference as 25%. I require 283 people. Halfway through, you look at the interim hazard and it's 10%, not 25%. And so basically the correct answer for the hazard ratio, you'd only have 22% power. Is it the right thing to do to save the study? Because what you'd be doing is saying, before I got started on this, I knew what a clinically significant difference was. It was a 25% reduction. That's how much it takes to really change the opinion of clinicians. And halfway through, I'm going to say, whoops, I was wrong. A 10% is the clinically significant difference that it will take to change clinicians. I mean, you just changed what the definition that you said what the important difference was. I mean, make up your mind. What do you want? By the way, I don't believe in adaptive designs. Perhaps you can sense that. But anyway, so it's changing your mind about what a clinically significant difference really is the right thing to do. So which is better, group sequential design. Oh, I'm not going to worry about that. I'm going to skip that slide. So basically, remember we focus on group sequential designs versus adaptive designs. Adaptive designs focusing on nuisance parameters are probably a good idea, even though I'm not wild about them. Criteria for making the adaptive group sequential decision. I've suggested that we ought to look at which one has the smaller sample size. Group sequentials are uniformly better. We should look at logistical issues. Sequential trials seem to have fewer issues, but I don't know how big my study is in NIH. Just give me a pile of cash. And other issues is that I'm not sure that saving studies are meaningful. And so basically, to me, other than really sounding like you're really a depth statistician, which believe me, this is a lot of trend, a lot of it's like what jackets you're wearing kind of stuff in statistics. Right now, it's very trendy to do an adaptive design. To me, I don't see the benefit. Are y'all worn out? Is this interesting? I'll do a little bit more and then I'll quit. The other hot new trend that you ought to be aware of is this idea of a Bayesian analysis. I'm going to give you this, by the way, is a whole semester in 30 seconds. Okay. First of all, what is this Bayesian analysis? Well, the idea of being a frequentist, which is generally what I am, I do most of mine as a frequentist analysis, is I think the treatment difference exists in nature. It's there. It's a number that exists out there in the ether. There's a certain benefit or harm for a treatment. Okay? It is fixed. It exists. And my goal is to guess at what that is. That's the frequentist approach. The Bayesian approach says, well, it's not really a number, but it's sort of a distribution of numbers. There could be differences, and it sort of depends on which one it is. And I'm going to describe the difference not as a single number, but as a distribution of numbers. Okay? And what is really important about the Bayesian analysis is I could know a lot about what that difference is. I might not be going in completely naive. I might have information about what that difference is. Okay? And the goal then is to update that information that I know with the information from the study and come up with a new and improved idea of what the difference is. Okay, that's the Bayesian approach. Okay, the advantage of the Bayesian approach is I get to use the information that I might have. If you stop and think about it, you don't do these multi-million-dollar studies with no information. Okay, you don't wander in and say, I'm going to do a randomized clinical trial on 2,000 people. So using that information sounds cool. So, so basically I don't need to say if there's substantial prior information. The more I know earlier, the more I can know later, right? Okay? Then I can be powerfully used as a huge win. However, if the prior information, if there's not a lot of prior information, doing a Bayesian analysis, when there's not a lot of prior information, you gain very little. Okay? You end up about the same as doing a frequentist analysis. Does this make sense at all? Okay. Anyway, so some can argue Bayesian analysis allows adaptive designs to be implemented. There's a guy named Don Berry, who's from Houston, who's made Bayesian adaptive designs one word. I mean, it's amazing. He's made it so it's all one word. And it's true that you can do adaptive designs in Bayesian analysis, but you can also do adaptive designs with a frequentist approach. And a lot of people don't appreciate that. Some will argue that Bayesian analysis answers the logical question that can easily be argued that, Bayesians say that the way they think is more intuitive. People think the way that Bayesians think. I'll say that I don't. I think when you try to explain the results of a Bayesian trial to a clinician, it's harder. I think saying there's a difference is really easy to understand. So is this really something we want to do? To begin with, our 100% Bayesian approaches have the advantage of optimally using information from previous studies to inform phase 3 trials. It allows the smooth transition from the phase 2 to the phase 3 trials. What kind of fool would not want to use prior information? And the answer is me. I don't want to use the prior information. I think using the prior information is a mistake. It's wrong to do. It's not that Bayesian analysis is wrong. It's that using that prior information in the phase 3 trial is not a good thing to do. Why do I think that? Well, there are problems that we know. There are problems about what we know. Remember, I said I'm going to use the prior information. Okay, so we have to agree about what we know. Okay, we all have to agree, and we have to know exactly the right amount. I'm going to come and explain these in a little bit more detail. And we can't be systematically wrong about what we know. Okay, so let's stop and think: is that the case? Well, let's say that this is my prior. This is what I think the treatment difference is, and I do an experiment. And this is my posterior, my after the experiment. And you can see that after the experiment, in this example, almost all of it would be for a benefit. Okay? So, yay, I get to use my new treatment. That's the kind of stuff you're doing in Bayesian analysis. But let's say that that's not my prior, this is my prior. I do exactly the same experiment, and now this is my posterior. The experiment was the same. What changed was the prior. Okay, how much I thought I knew when I got started. Okay, so changing the prior changes the posterior. And for it to be uniformly interpreted, we all have to agree about what we know. Okay, a remarkable thing, because I'll say that what do academics do well? We write papers, we care for patients, we teach students, we do that very well. What don't we do well? We don't agree about what we know. Of all things that as academics we do poorly, agreeing about how much we know is not our strength. And so I will argue that one person's prior might not be another person's. You want to include animal models. If there's a poorly done trial that you do want to downweight, I might think it shouldn't be included. So that changes my prior. Okay, so stop and think about the chaos that would happen if what we do is a $50 million randomized clinical trial, And you say that it shows benefit, and I say it doesn't, and we're using exactly the same data, and the difference is how much we thought before we got started. That is going to be a bad, bad situation. Okay, now, if it's hard to listen for 2 hours, you're going to try talking for 2 hours. Okay. Anyway, so the second issue is we have to know just the right amount to make this work. What do I mean by that? Remember that the only gain from doing Bayesian analysis is if we know something. If we don't know a lot, we gain virtually nothing. It's only if we have what's called an informative prior. Only if we know information when we go in. Okay? So remember that a randomized trial is based on equipoise. If we know too much, I'll argue we're not at equipoise. And if we are, we're going to have to do informed consent. And so can you imagine consenting a patient that says, we're about 80% sure that this new treatment is better than the old treatment. But 80% is not enough for the guidelines, so we would like to randomize you to receive the new treatment or the old treatment. I mean, that would be a hard, informed consent. Okay? I certainly wouldn't be in your study. I won't be 80%. Okay? So where do we draw the line? If it's 60-40, is that good enough to say, I don't know which one's best? How about 70-30? I don't know. Where would you draw the line to say that I'm at equipoise? It's not an easy thing. And so then finally, and this, by the way, is the most important one, why Bayesian analysis for phase 3 trials is not a great idea. We ought to avoid it. By the way, very trendy also, incredibly trendy. Okay? Is that we can pretend that the current study is the only study we're doing, that is being done. Okay? But we can also hope to come to this lecture riding a unicorn. I mean, we could hope for that too. Okay? But basically, from 30,000 feet, there are really hundreds of compounds. This is not a single thing. This is a system that is evaluating hundreds of alternative treatments for tens of diseases. And all of them are coming down, and they all get weeded down, and then finally only a very few have a phase 3 study. Only a very few get there. Hundreds, maybe thousands start. Tens, maybe ones, get to the phase 3 trial. Okay. Now, there are only a few make it to phase 2 and phase 3. There are reasons why a compound advances. The first reason is that it's a promising compound. It actually, by God, does work. Okay. The other is that through a random process, it inappropriately appears to work. In other words, I've done the phase 2. Boy, it looks promising. But now I'm going to, but the reason it looks promising was I got dealt a very nice hand. All the good patients got into good treatment. Stuff happens. Sometimes it looks like things work when they don't work. And you can't know, by the way, things that don't look very promising don't get brought forward. And so for the things that get brought forward, part of it is that it is likely to work. And part of it is it's likely you got to withdraw. Okay? And statistically, conditional on it making to phase 3, the phase 2 data are biased. Phase 2 studies always look better than they are. Of studies that make it to phase 3, the phase 2 studies are inappropriately looking good. Do you see why? Because to get there, you either had something that works or you got lucky, or both. The chances are you got lucky, because even if it works, if you got unlucky, it wouldn't be there. So you only get the lucky draws. Okay? If the phase 2 is biased, then incorporating that biased information will give you a biased posterior. And so I'm arguing that Bayesian analysis for phase, the great idea, just shouldn't be used for phase 3 trials, primarily because of this. And then the last point is, do we really want to use all that prior information anyway? Okay, and the knee jerk is, of course I want to use it. Who would not want to use information? And I'll argue that suppose that we're getting ready to do a pivotal trial. Does it make sense, this is philosophy, to wipe the board clean, start with a clean slate, and see who wins. You know, to me, wiping the board clean is a cool idea. You know, to me, not using the information is the right decision. Let's be as hard as we can before we recommend this treatment. You know, is it a bad decision to have an independent assessment of a new treatment? I don't think it's a bad decision to have an independent assessment. So basically, I'm not a frequentist, but someone who just tries to understand the best tools. Bayesian analysis have many, many great areas where they're powerful tools. I'm just not sure it's best for a randomized clinical trial. Missing data. I only have 2 more domains and I'm done. I know y'all are sick of me at this point. So 2 more. You can make it. You can make it. Anyway, missing data. Clearly the best approach to having missing data is to not have missing data. That's the best way to address it. Spend a lot of time when you're planning a study to do everything you can to not have missing data. You'll have it. Okay? And so basically it's more common than we wish. People do not drop out of these studies at random. The sick people drop out of the studies. The frail people drop out of the studies. So basically, who you're dropping out of your study are the people who's going to have an event next, which is exactly what you don't want to have happen. Assuming they do, it gives you the wrong answers. Okay. Remarkably hot area in biostat, longitudinal modeling, propensity scores, multiple imputation, lots of approaches to address this. Don't have time to talk about it now, but if you have a lot of missing data, go find a good statistician and start buying them drinks. Because you're going to have to be good. This is missing data is the statistician's full employment hour. It's going to ensure that we have jobs forever. It is unbelievable. By the way, my favorite book is Don Rubin's book on this. I'll say it and see if I can think it tickles my fancy. The title of the book is The Analysis of Missing Data. So just think about that for a while. Wow. But anyway, so we're down to I'm going to skip factorial because I'm tired of talking, but basically you can do a 2x2 study. And I'm going to go because I was asked to talk about DSM-Vidis and just do the last point. So basically, there are lots of reasons why you need an independent monitoring rule. Okay? The first reason is I'm in a huge conflict. I don't want my study to stop because if my study stops, they're going to fire me. Okay? Because I'm in a position where basically I am welcome to keep my job as long as I write a lot of papers and pay my salary. Welcome to academics. And so I don't want I've got CREST, the study I'm talking about, is funded through 2022. This is cool. I mean, I've got a job until 2022 unless somebody stops the damn study. Okay? Okay, that is a huge conflict of interest. Okay? You don't want me to be the person making the decision to stop my own study. Okay? The second reason is I couldn't stop it anyway because I'm not permitted to see the data. And so how could I stop it if I say the data looks bad if I don't get to see the data? And so basically, hence you have something called a data safety monitoring board, sometimes called a data safety monitoring committee. It's generally 5, 7, sometimes 3 for little studies of members. They're not associated with any trial, any study that's in the trial generally. Okay. CREST, the study I'm talking about, has 140 medical centers in the United States and counting. So the first challenge of these boards is quick. Who is number 141st best clinical center in the United States? I mean, all the good ones are in the study. Everybody knows about the study is participating in the study. So you have to find experts that know about it. Content experts for us, we have surgeons and neurologists for our content experts. Usually at least 1, maybe 2 biostatisticians. If you're a liberal, you include a patient advocate or an ethicist. Okay, believe it or not, as much as I believe in informed consent, think that if you have a patient advocate on this, it cannot be a normal person off the street. It has to be somebody pretty darn scientific, because these decisions that are being made need to be made with love and care for the patients who are the heroes and heroines of these studies. But boy, they're hard sometimes. Boy, they're hard sometimes. In CREST, the first 7 patients who died were all in the same group. I mean, you sit there and go, oh, another one, kind of, I mean, it's like people hitting you in the face. Do you want to stop with 7 deaths in one group? Wow. I mean, it's hard decisions. Thank God we did the stuff. They're commonly appointed by the funding agency. If you're NIH funded, you don't get to pick them. NIH gets to pick them. And they are advisory to the funding agency, not to the study. So they tell NIH to quit giving you money. That's how the study gets stopped. They are normally meets about prior to the study to approve the protocol. Stop and think about what I've just said. You've spent 2 years getting your grant funded. You have a protocol. You've got a group of people who were chosen because they have nothing to do with the protocol. They get to read the protocol and say whether or not they approve it or not. Good scientists never agree. And so they're going to disagree with some aspects of your protocol, and you have the opportunity to change it, because they are ultimately powerful. And they need to have that authority. It's a good thing for them to have. For example, the stopping rule. If they don't like the stopping rule, this is Brian Fleming, they say, no, I won't use land, and that's the other people who have to deal with it. They're the people who have to go to sleep at night feeling comfortable with what they've done. They appropriately should be have input. Normally, they meet at 6-month intervals to review progress. They are either unmasked, in other words, they are unblinded, or they're at least A/B blinded. Some committees prefer not to know which treatment is which, and just have them labeled A and B, because they want to not have their biases come into it. Normally, I think that's a bunch of hooey. I think if you're smart, you know, but like in our world, all the groin hematomas turns out happen in the stenting group, and that doesn't tend to happen a lot in the endarterectomy group. And so, if you look at the data, you can probably unblind yourself pretty easily. Okay. They review the data at 6-month intervals. By the way, this is the way I think it should be done. At 6-month intervals, they review the study process, the data quality, and the patient safety. The progress in the data quality turns out recruitment is an ethical issue. Data quality is an ethical issue. If you have a study that is not recruiting enough patients to ever finish, it is unethical to continue your study. It needs to be reviewed, and if you're not making it, the study needs to be shut down. If you're collecting data that's a bunch of garbage, it's an ethical issue. The study needs to be shut down. You need to have somebody independently looking at that to make sure that you're doing a good job. Patient safety, I'm going to have to talk about a little bit more, but they also look at the patient safety. Remember, there's not a stopping rule for safety. It's, can I go to sleep and be happy that these patients are being protected? Because there's no way to write down the menu of things that can happen from the safety standpoint. Okay. The hard one is that different committees do it differently, but I think the way to do it for efficacy is they never look at treatment differences for the primary outcome, except for at points where the stopping rule says the study should be stopped, or could be stopped. Let's say that I'll look at 6 months, and that's not a time when I plan to look. By the way, the idea of these alpha spending functions is I'm going to look at 2 years, I'm going to look at 4 years, I'm going to look at 6 years. So let's say I look at 1 year, not one of those times, and I see a big difference. What am I going to do? Is it ethical to continue? Should I stop the study? One of the things that I believe is for the efficacy outcome, don't tell me anything that I shouldn't be making a decision about. Just keep me blind until you get to the point when we all agree, I'll stop the study if it makes me unhappy. So you don't look at efficacy. And they can advise the termination. They can advise the termination of the study because somebody else published a paper. They can stop it for any reason they want. Basically, key safety terms. I think this is almost my last slide. An adverse event becomes serious if it meets one of these criteria. This is not. This is FDA lingo, and whether or not it's serious or not is not this matter of opinion, but does it meet specified criteria? It becomes unanticipated if it's not discussed in the informed consent and it's not expected in similar patients. So basically, deaths in my study are anticipated. Strokes are anticipated. Those are not unanticipated events. I know those are going to happen. So it's not as a real bad thing that makes me unhappy that it happened to the patient. But if it says in the informed consent, you might die on the table, it won't say it like that. That is an anticipated event. Okay? It's associated with the treatment if it's likely to be caused by the treatment. That's the iffy one. Probably is, I think this one could be associated with the treatment. One of the things in surgical trials is, in general, anything that happens within 30 days of a procedure is considered associated with the treatment. If it happens temporarily close to it, it's associated. Okay? The trial is required under regulation to urgently report serious unanticipated events. Oh, bells ring, angels sing, you have a serious unanticipated event. And decisions to stop, hopefully the stopping rules for efficacy are in place prior to recruitment. Even with stopping rules, stopping for efficacy is complicated. When you're making that decision, it is gut-wrenching. We shut down ACAS early. ACAS was shut down early because overall there was an effect, and it left us with an unclear understanding of, does this procedure work in women? If we would have continued this study, we would have gotten this incredibly important information about the efficacy of endarterectomy in women. Still a matter of debate. We're getting ready. We have a trial under review right now to do the women's endarterectomy stuff. Because we didn't just, damn it, continue ACAS. We get that one little piece of it, even though overall it was beneficial. It's not an easy decision. There's no systematic rules for stopping for safety, and I think that's it, thank God. But anyway, any questions or anything? I know that was 1,000 little things, but that's what, 1,000. Is that okay?
Thank you.
Thank y'all.
You're like, what?
Yes,
Yeah, they do, I kind of like it. They'll pick a topic, so you like see it. One time they did, group culture, or to get us
never is. Cool.
Everything else. It didn't look like they did back here today, that's why I asked. There wasn't any. Yeah, it looked like, definitely somebody had been in here, but I mean, it wasn't, there was food everywhere, and the furniture wasn't.